In a jaw-dropping twist, a rude waiter snubs Michael Jordan's mother, and he catches every single moment with wide-eyed disbelief. What unfolds next is set to turn the tables in the most unexpected way. The shotgun blast echoed through the eye. Silent forest, drowning out Dolores's scream. She stood frozen 30 feet away from where her son Michael had just fallen, his body now slumped against the moss-covered log. The early morning mist hung between the ancient redwoods, shrouding the scene in an otherworldly haze. "No, no, no." The words tumbled from her lips as she rushed forward, her boots slipping on the damp forest floor. Behind her, Carlos lowered the hunting rifle, his face ashen, hands trembling so violently that the weapon clattered to the ground. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us which city you are watching us from. We continue. I thought he was... Carlos stammered, his voice barely audible. Dolores reached Michael and fell to her knees. Blood bloomed across her son's faded flannel shirt, his breathing shallow and ragged. His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with effort. "Mom," he whispered. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." She pressed her hands against the wound, warm blood seeping between her fingers. "Don't talk. We need to get you help." Her voice broke as she turned toward Carlos, who stood paralyzed. "Call 911 now!" Carlos fumbled for his phone, but they all knew the truth. There was no reception this deep in the Redwood National Forest. The nearest road was 3 miles away. The nearest hospital 40 minutes beyond that. Michael's hand weakly gripped Dolores's wrist. "Listen to me," he rasped. "The box under my bed, everything you need to know is there." "What are you talking about?" Panic rose in her chest. "Michael, please save your strength." "Promise me," he insisted, his eyes suddenly clear and intense. "Promise you'll look." "I promise," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "But you're going to be fine." Michael's lips curled into a faint smile. Always the optimist. His eyes drifted past her to the canopy above, where sunlight filtered through the morning fog, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. "It's beautiful here," he murmured. Dolores felt his grip loosen as his breathing grew more labored. Behind her, Carlos approached cautiously, his face contorted with horror and guilt. "We need to carry him out," Carlos said. "Maybe if we—" A sharp crack of a branch snapping nearby cut him short. Both Dolores and Carlos turned toward the sound, tensing. Detective Ryan Walsh emerged from between 2 massive redwoods, his service pistol drawn. His weathered face registered surprise, then grim understanding as he took in the scene before him. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, holstering his weapon and rushing forward. "What happened here?" Dolores looked up at him, recognition dawning through her shock. "Detective Walsh?" For one suspended moment, the 4 of them formed a tableau in the ancient forest. Michael bleeding out on the ground, Dolores kneeling beside him, Carlos standing shell-shocked with empty hands, and Detective Walsh, a man who shouldn't have been there at all, surveying the catastrophe with eyes that held too much knowledge. 6 months earlier, Dolores Jordan had returned to Redwood Harbor with reluctance etched into every line of her face. The small coastal town in Northern California hadn't changed much in the 8 years she'd been gone. Same weathered buildings facing the Pacific, same fog rolling in each morning to blanket the harbor, same whispers that followed anyone with the Jordan name. She parked her 10-year-old Subaru in front of her childhood home, a Victorian house perched on the bluff overlooking the sea. Once grand, it now showed signs of neglect, peeling paint, missing shingles, and overgrown garden. Dolores sat in the car for several minutes, gathering courage, before finally grabbing her duffel bag and approaching the front door. She didn't need to knock. Michael opened the door before she reached it, his tall frame filling the doorway. At 38, 4 years her senior, his once youthful face now showed premature lines of worry, and his dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples. But his smile, rare and genuine, hadn't changed. "About time you showed up," he said, pulling her into a hug that smelled of wood smoke and coffee. "Traffic was terrible," she lied, knowing he understood she'd been delaying the inevitable. "How is she?" Michael's smile faded. Some days are better than others. Today's not great. He stepped aside to let her in. She might not recognize you. The house's interior was just as Dolores remembered. Dark wood, faded photographs, the persistent scent of lilac air freshener fighting against musty books and old memories. What had changed was the medical equipment now occupying the front parlor, transformed into a makeshift bedroom for their mother. Eleanor Jordan had once been the town's most respected judge, brilliant, fierce, and uncompromising. Now she lay diminished against white pillows, her once sharp eyes clouded by the dementia that had swallowed most of her memories. When Dolores approached the bed, Eleanor looked up with polite confusion. "Hello," she said with the careful formality of someone greeting a stranger. "Are you the new nurse?" Dolores swallowed the lump in her throat. "It's me, Mom, Dolores." Eleanor studied her face with faint recognition. "Dolores." "Yes. You have your father's eyes." Then, with sudden clarity, "Why did you come back? It's not safe for you here." Michael and Dolores exchanged worried glances. "I'm perfectly safe, Mom," Dolores assured her. "I came back to help with your care." Eleanor's eyes darted to the window, then back to Dolores. "They never found the body, you know. That's what they held against your father, no body." "Mom," Michael interrupted gently, "let's not talk about that now. Dolores just got here." But Eleanor grabbed Dolores's wrist with surprising strength. "Carlos Hammond knows more than he says. Always has." Then, as quickly as it had come, the moment of lucidity passed, and Eleanor's gaze drifted back to the window, to the sea beyond. Later that evening, after getting Eleanor settled for the night with the help of her part-time nurse, Dolores and Michael sat on the back porch, each nursing a glass of whiskey. The rhythmic sound of waves breaking against the cliffs below provided a soothing backdrop to an otherwise tense silence. "She mentions Dad more often now," Michael finally said. "The past is more real to her than the present." Dolores swirled, the amber liquid in her glass. "I thought coming back would be easier after all this time. Is it ever?" Michael asked with a sad smile. The Jordan family had been Redwood Harbor's most prominent until 20 years ago, when Judge Thomas Jordan, their father, had been convicted of murdering local fisherman Scott Lawson after a heated public argument. Despite no body ever being found, the circumstantial evidence had been enough for a conviction. Thomas had died in prison 5 years later, maintaining his innocence until the end. "I saw Carlos Hammond in town yesterday," Michael said casually, too casually. "His father's hardware store is his now." Dolores tensed. Carlos had been her first love, her high school sweetheart, until the trial had torn everything apart. His father had been Scott Lawson's best friend and the prosecution's star witness against her father. "And?" she asked, trying to sound indifferent. "And nothing. Just thought you should know before you run into him." Dolores took a long sip of whiskey, welcoming the burn. "I didn't come back for reconciliations or to dig up the past, Michael. I'm here for Mom, that's all." Michael studied her over the rim of his glass. "Sure," he said, unconvinced. "Just like I'm just a simple boat tour guide who happens to spend a lot of time researching old case files." "Michael," Dolores warned, "don't." 20 years, Dolores. 20 years and no one has ever found Scott Lawson's body. Don't you think that's strange?" "What I think," Dolores said, standing up, "is that we've both paid enough for something that happened when I was 12. I'm going to bed." As she walked away, Michael called after her. "Detective Ryan Walsh retired from San Francisco PD last year, moved here 3 months ago. Interesting coincidence, don't you think?" Dolores paused but didn't turn around. "I don't know who that is." "The rookie cop who found the blood evidence in Dad's boat. He's living in the old lighthouse keeper's cottage now. Says he's writing a book." A chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze ran down Dolores's spine, but she continued inside without replying. That night, Dolores couldn't sleep. Her childhood bedroom felt both familiar and foreign, like a museum exhibit of her former self. The shelf of debate team trophies, the faded posters of bands she'd once loved, the window seat where she'd spent countless hours watching the sea, all preserved as if awaiting her return. Around 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep and padded downstairs for a glass of water. As she passed her mother's room, she heard Eleanor's voice, surprisingly clear. "Michael, is that you?" Dolores hesitated, then entered the room. "It's Dolores, Mom." Eleanor was sitting up in bed, more alert than she'd been earlier. "Dolores," she said, patting the edge of the bed. "Come sit with me." Dolores obliged, taking her mother's frail hand in hers. "I need to tell you something important," Eleanor said, her voice low and urgent. "About your father." Dolores's heart raced. What about him? He wasn't what they said he was. Eleanor's eyes were clear, focused. "The night Scott disappeared, your father was with me the entire time. I lied on the stand when I said he went out in the boat. I lied because..." She suddenly stopped, confusion clouding her features again. "Who are you?" "Mom, it's Dolores," she said, squeezing Eleanor's hand. "Please, what were you saying about Dad?" But Eleanor had retreated back into the fog of her illness, her momentary clarity gone. "I'm very tired now," she mumbled, settling back against her pillows. "Tell the judge I'll be ready in the morning." Dolores sat there for a long time after her mother had fallen asleep, her mind racing with questions. If her mother had lied on the stand, why? What had she been about to reveal? And if Thomas Jordan hadn't been out on his boat that night, how had Scott Lawson's blood ended up there? The Salty Dog Cafe sat at the edge of the harbor, its weathered exterior belying the warm atmosphere inside. Dolores had been back in Redwood Harbor for 3 weeks, settling into a routine of caring for her mother and helping Michael with his boat tour business. She'd managed to avoid most of the town's awkward stares and whispers, but she couldn't hide forever. She chose a quiet corner table and ordered coffee, pulling out her laptop to catch up on work. As a freelance graphic designer, she could work from anywhere. A convenience that had made returning to Redwood Harbor possible, though not necessarily easier. "Dolores Jordan, never thought I'd see you back here." She looked up to find Carlos Hammond standing beside her table, a takeout coffee in hand. At 35, he'd grown from the lanky teenager she remembered into a broad-shouldered man with the calloused hands of someone who worked with tools. His eyes, though, those deep blue eyes that had once looked at her with such devotion, now held a wary distance. "Carlos," she acknowledged, closing her laptop. "Michael mentioned you're running the hardware store now." He nodded. "Going on 5 years since Dad retired. He passed last winter." "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and meant it despite everything. An awkward silence stretched between them, 20 years of unspoken words hanging in the air. "How's your mother?" he finally asked. "Not good. Dementia. Some days she doesn't. Know who I am?" Something like sympathy crossed his face. "That's tough. My mom had it at the end, too." Dolores hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from her. "Do you want to sit for a minute?" Carlos glanced at his watch, then shrugged and sat down. "I have a few minutes before the store opens." They talked about safe topics, the changes in town, the fishing season, the weather. It was strange how easily they fell into conversation, as if rehearsing lines from a play about two people who hadn't wounded each other deeply. As Carlos was about to leave, Dolores found herself asking, "Do you ever think about it? About what happened?" His expression shuttered. "Every day of my life. My mother said something strange the other night, about my father being home the night Scott disappeared. She said she lied on the stand." Carlos's face paled. "Dolores..." "What? If my father was innocent, Carlos, what if..." "Stop," he said sharply. "Just stop. My uncle is still gone. Nothing will bring him back." "Your uncle?" Dolores said, confused. "Scott was your father's friend, not..." "My mother's brother," Carlos cut in. "Didn't you know Scott Lawson was my uncle?" The revelation hit Dolores like a physical blow. All those years, and she'd never known this crucial detail. It explained so much. The Hammond family's vehemence at the trial, their unshakable belief. And Thomas Jordan's guilt. "I didn't know," she said softly. Carlos stood, his coffee untouched. "There's a lot you don't know, Dolores. Some stones are better left unturned." He hesitated, then added, For what it's worth, I'm sorry about your mom. Despite everything, she was always kind to me." As he walked away, Dolores felt a familiar thunk. Whatever had once existed between them had been sacrificed on the altar of their family's tragedy. Some wounds were too deep to heal. Back at home, Dolores found Michael in their father's old study, walls covered with maps, photographs, and sticky notes connected by red string, a physical manifestation of his obsession with their father's case. "You never told me Scott Lawson was Carlos Hammond's uncle," she accused without preamble. Michael looked up from the file he was reading. "I thought you knew." "How would I know? No one ever talked about it." Michael sighed. "It wasn't exactly a secret, Dolores. Mom and Dad just didn't like to talk about the Hammonds after, well, everything." Dolores paced the small room. "Mom said something the other night. She said Dad was home the night Scott disappeared, that she lied on the stand." Michael's eyes widened. "She said that when she was lucid?" "Yes, but then she slipped away again before she could explain why." Michael ran a hand through his hair. "This changes everything. If Dad had an alibi, then how did Scott's blood get on his boat?" Dolores finished the thought. "Maybe someone borrowed it or planted the evidence." Michael pointed to a photograph on the wall. "That's Ryan Walsh, the cop who found the blood evidence. Convenient that he moved here right after Mom started having these moments of clarity, don't you think?" Dolores studied the photograph of a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes. "You think he's involved somehow?" "I think it's suspicious that the key witness in Dad's case shows up in town 20 years later, right when I start asking questions again." Dolores felt a chill. "What kind of questions have you been asking, Michael?" Her brother's eyes gleamed with an intensity that bordered on fervor, the kind that might finally clear Dad's name. Over the next 2 months, Dolores found herself drawn deeper into Michael's investigation, despite her initial reluctance. What began as skepticism gradually transformed into conviction as they uncovered inconsistencies in the original case. Witness testimonies that contradicted each other, evidence that seemed to have been selectively presented, and most disturbing, pages missing from the official police report. One rainy afternoon, while Michael was out giving a tour to a group of tourists, Dolores was organizing his chaotic notes when she found a small black notebook hidden beneath a stack of papers. It contained Michael's personal observations, including detailed notes on Detective Ryan Walsh's daily routines, photographs of Walsh meeting with Carlos Hammond, and most alarmingly, a list titled "People Who Know the Truth," with both their names near the top. When Michael returned, soaked from the rain and in high spirits, Dolores confronted him with the notebook. "What is this, Michael? Are you stalking Detective Walsh?" Her brother's smile faded. "I'm monitoring him. There's a difference." "And Carlos? Why are you watching him too?" Michael took off his rain jacket and hung it by the door. "Because they've been meeting regularly since Walsh moved to town. Doesn't that strike you as odd?" Dolores thought of her conversation with Carlos at the cafe, his warning about leaving stones unturned. "Maybe they're friends, maybe it has nothing to do with Dad's case." Michael scoffed. "Sure, and maybe Mom's moments of lucidity mentioning Dad's innocence are just coincidence too." He took the notebook from her hands. "I thought you were with me on this, Dolores." "I am, but this..." She gestured to the wall of obsession he'd created. "This is bordering on paranoia. We need hard evidence, not conspiracy theories." Michael's expression hardened. "What do you think I've been trying to find? But every time I get close, something happens. Files go missing, people clam up." He lowered his voice. "Someone doesn't want the truth to come out." "Or maybe there's nothing to find because Dad was guilty," Dolores suggested, immediately regretting her words at the look of betrayal on Michael's face. "Get out," he said quietly. "Michael, I said get out. If you're not with me on this, you're against me, just like everyone else in this damn town." Dolores retreated, knowing her brother well enough to recognize when he couldn't be reasoned with. As she closed the study door behind her, she heard the sound of something shattering against the wall. That evening, unable to shake her unease, Dolores decided to take a walk along the beach to clear her head. The sky was clearing after the Rain and a full moon cast silver light across the churning waves. She walked without direction, eventually finding herself at the base of the old lighthouse where Ryan Walsh now lived. To her surprise, a figure was standing at the water's edge, Walsh himself, skipping stones into the surf. He turned at the sound of her approach, recognition flickering across his features. "Dolores Jordan," he said, "I was wondering when you'd come find me." She stopped a few feet away from him. "You know who I am. Small town," he replied with a shrug. "Plus you look like your father." He skipped another stone, watching it bounce 5 times before disappearing beneath the waves. "I assume you have questions." "Why are you here?" Dolores asked bluntly. "After all this time?" Walsh studied her for a long moment before answering. "Unfinished business. With my family. With the truth." He looked out at the horizon. "I made a mistake 20 years ago. A rookie mistake that cost your father his life and freedom." Dolores's heart hammered in her chest. What kind of mistake? "I believed what I was told to believe. I saw what I was directed to see." Walsh turned to face her fully. "I didn't question when evidence appeared too conveniently or when my superiors pushed for a quick resolution. I was young, eager to prove myself." "Are you saying my father was set up, that you helped frame him?" Walsh grimaced. "Not intentionally, but I was a pawn in something bigger than I understood at the time." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim file. "This is a copy of my personal notes from the investigation. The real notes, not the official report. I think you and your brother should read it." Dolores stared at the file, afraid to take it. "Why now? Why not come forward years ago?" "Because I didn't have proof then, just suspicions, and because—" Walsh hesitated. "Because some of the people involved were powerful. Still are. But I'm retired now, with nothing to lose. And your mother's illness. It's making people nervous." "Nervous about what?" "About what she might remember. About what she might say." Walsh held out the file insistently. "Take it, but be careful who you trust with this information." As Dolores reached for the file, a sharp voice called out, "Dolores!" She turned to see Carlos walking rapidly toward them, his face tight with anger. "What are you doing?" Walsh quickly withdrew the file, tucking it back inside his jacket. "Evening, Hammond," he said coolly. "Stay away from her," Carlos warned, reaching Dolores's side. "And you," he said to Dolores, "we need to talk, now." "I don't take orders from you, Carlos," Dolores replied, bristling at his tone. "Please," Carlos said, his voice softening. "It's important." Dolores looked between the two men, sensing an undercurrent she didn't fully understand. "Fine," she conceded. "Detective Walsh and I were finished anyway." Walsh nodded, his expression guarded. "Think about what I said, Dolores. The truth isn't always what we think it is." With that cryptic remark, he turned and walked back toward the lighthouse. Carlos practically dragged Dolores away from the beach, his grip on her arm both protective and restraining. When they reached the parking lot, he finally released her. "What were you thinking, talking to Walsh alone?" "He approached me," Dolores defended herself. "And what business is it of yours anyway?" Carlos ran a hand over his face. "You don't understand what you're getting into, Dolores. Your brother's been stirring up old ghosts, asking questions that are putting both of you in danger." "Danger from whom?" "The person who really killed your uncle." Carlos flinched. "There are things about that night, about what happened, that you don't know." "Then tell me," Dolores challenged. For a moment it seemed he might. Something vulnerable flickered in his eyes, the shadow of the boy she'd once loved. But then the shutters came down again. "I can't. But I'm begging you, Dolores. Drop this. Tell Michael to drop it too, for both your sakes." "Why should I trust you?" she asked. "You let them convict my father. Your family testified against him." Pain crossed Carlos's face. "We believed he was guilty. We all did." "And now?" Carlos looked away. "Now, I don't know anymore." Before Dolores could respond, her phone rang, Michael wondering where she was. As she answered, Carlos turned to leave. "Carlos, wait," she called after him. "At least tell me why you've been meeting with Walsh." He paused but didn't turn back. "We have a common interest in setting things right," he said enigmatically, then walked away into the gathering darkness. 2 days later, Michael burst into Dolores's room at dawn, his eyes wild with excitement. "I know where it is," he said without preamble. "I know where Scott Lawson's body is buried." Dolores sat up, instantly alert. "What? How?" "Walsh's file. I broke into his cottage last night and found it." Michael was pacing, unable to contain his energy. "There's a map, Dolores, coordinates, in the redwood forest near the old hiking trails." "You broke in? Michael, are you insane?" Desperate times, he dismissed her concern. "Get dressed, we need to go now before someone else finds it." "Finds what, a 20-year-old body, if it even exists?" Dolores got out of bed, trying to reason with him. "Michael, this is crazy. We should go to the police." "The police?" Michael laughed bitterly. "The same police who framed our father? No, we need proof first. Irrefutable evidence that Dad was innocent." Dolores hesitated. "And you think digging up a body is going to provide that?" "If Scott Lawson's body shows evidence that contradicts the prosecution's theory, yes." Michael grabbed her shoulders. "Dolores, this is what we've been working toward. Don't back out now." Against her better judgment, Dolores agreed. They dressed in hiking clothes, packed supplies, and slipped out of the house before the nurse arrived for their mother's mourning. Kare. The drive to the trailhead was tense, with Michael explaining his theory that Scott had been killed elsewhere and buried in the forest to frame their father. The hike took nearly 2 hours, following coordinates Michael had memorized from Walsh's file. The morning fog still clung to the ancient redwoods, creating an eerie, otherworldly atmosphere. When they finally reached the spot Michael was looking for, a small clearing near a fallen log, they found the ground had already been disturbed. "Someone's been here recently," Michael said, kneeling to examine the soil. "The earth is freshly turned." A twig snapped behind them. They turned to see Carlos emerging from the trees, a hunting rifle in his hands. His face was a mask of determined resignation. "I told you to drop it," he said, his voice hollow. "I warned you." "Carlos," Dolores said slowly, rising to her feet. "What are you doing?" "What I have to do." He raised the rifle. "Step away from there, both of you." Michael stood his ground. "You know, don't you? You know what really happened to Scott." Carlos's hands trembled slightly. "I'm trying to protect you. Can't you see that?" "By threatening us with a gun?" Dolores asked, inching closer to her brother. "I never wanted it to come to this," Carlos said, pain evident in his voice. "But you wouldn't listen. You just kept digging." "Because our father died in prison for a crime he didn't commit," Michael shouted. "You don't know that," Carlos countered. "But you do," Michael pressed. "Don't you, Carlos? You know who really killed Scott." In the split second that Carlos's focus wavered, Michael lunged forward, attempting to wrest the rifle from his hands. Dolores screamed as the two men struggled, the weapon between them. Then came the deafening crack of the shotgun, the sound that had started this story. Detective Ryan Walsh knelt beside Michael's body, checking for a pulse. His grim expression told Dolores everything she needed to know. "He's gone," Walsh confirmed quietly. "I'm sorry." Carlos had collapsed to his knees, the rifle discarded beside him. "I didn't mean to," he kept repeating. "It was an accident." Dolores couldn't process the reality before her. Her brother, her protector, her last remaining family besides their ailing mother, was gone. And for what? A 2-decade-old mystery that might never be solved. Walsh picked up the rifle, checking the safety before slinging it over his shoulder. "We need to get him out of here," he said with the detached efficiency of a man who had seen too many deaths. "Why were you following us?" Dolores asked numbly. "I've been keeping tabs on your brother since he broke into my cottage," Walsh explained. "I knew he'd come here eventually." He looked at the disturbed earth nearby. "They moved it. The body isn't here anymore." "Who moved it?" Dolores demanded, anger replacing shock. "Who are they?" Walsh glanced at Carlos, who sat silent and broken. Should you tell her, or should I? Carlos raised his head, tears streaming down his face. My father, he whispered. My father killed Scott. The confession hung in the air like the morning mist, heavy and suffocating. Why? Dolores asked, the single word encompassing 20 years of pain. Money, Carlos answered. Scott discovered my father was embezzling from their fishing business. Threatened to expose him. Dad, lost control, hit him with an oar, then he... Carlos swallowed hard. He used your father's boat to dispose of the body, but there was so much blood. When the investigation started pointing to Thomas Jordan, Dad saw an opportunity. He and the police chief, they were old friends. They made sure the evidence pointed to your father. Dolores felt dizzy with the revelation. And you knew all this time? Not until my father was dying, Carlos said. He confessed everything to me last winter, said he couldn't die with it on his conscience. But you still kept quiet, Dolores accused. He was my father, Carlos said simply, and he was already dying. What good would it have done? Walsh interjected. I suspected something wasn't right with the case for years. That's why I came here after I retired, to find the truth. I didn't know Michael had the same idea until I saw him watching me. Dolores looked between the two men, these strangers who had been central to her family's destruction. So what happens now? Walsh sighed heavily. Now we have a choice to make. 3 months later, Dolores stood by her mother's bedside as Eleanor Jordan drew her last breath. The cancer that had lurked alongside her dementia had finally claimed her, but not before a final moment of lucidity in which Dolores had been able to tell her that Thomas's name had been cleared. The official story, crafted carefully by Walsh with Dolores and Carlos's reluctant cooperation, was that new evidence had come to light exonerating Thomas Jordan and implicating Harold Hammond, who was now beyond earthly justice. Michael's death was ruled a hunting accident, a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The truth, that Michael had died pursuing justice, that Carlos had attempted to protect his father's dark secret, that Walsh had spent years trying to atone for his unwitting role in framing an innocent man, remained known only to the three of them. After the small funeral for Eleanor, Dolores found herself alone in the family home for the first time. She wandered from room to room, touching familiar objects, saying goodbye to ghosts. In Michael's study, she carefully took down the wall of investigation, packing away each piece of her brother's obsession with gentle reverence. Under his bed, she finally found the box he had mentioned with his dying breath. Inside was a journal, containing not case notes as she had expected, but letters, dozens of them all addressed to her. Letters Michael had written over the years but never sent, chronicling his life, his search for truth, his unwavering belief in their father's innocence, and most of all, his love for his sister, even when she was far away. On the front porch, Dolores found Carlos waiting, a respectful distance from the funeral proceedings. They stood in silence, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. What will you do now? Carlos finally asked. Dolores considered the question. The weight of silence, of secrets kept and truths revealed, had shaped her entire life. But now, with justice finally served, however imperfectly, that weight felt different. Not gone, but transformed. Live, she said simply. Try to live. Carlos nodded, understanding all she left unsaid. The path to forgiveness would be long and uncertain, but it had begun with truth, a truth that had cost them both dearly. As twilight deepened over Redwood Harbor, Dolores thought of Michael's final words about the beauty of the forest. Perhaps that was his final gift to her, the reminder that even in places marked by tragedy, beauty and grace could still be found. The silence between her and Carlos was no longer the silence of secrets, but of possibility. Fragile, tentative, but real. Like the ancient redwoods that had witnessed their family's tragedy, some things could endure, could grow stronger through adversity, reaching ever upward toward the light.